we worked on. Here, this is absolutely the boldest thing that you could think of. You take one of the darkest colours in the palette and use it basically as your main colour all the way through the station. And it works, of course, because it is the ultimate contrast to the space around that you have here. It requires just this rather minimal, you can see these head height, use of orange strips, but it actually does delineate the structure and therefore delineates the space that you want is available for your passenger to use. It's interesting, I was down in the new Nine Elms and Battersea station a few weeks ago, which were amongst the last station designs I helped worked on. And it's very easy, of course, for me to say as a retiree that it wouldn't have happened, it wouldn't look like that if I'd been in charge. I was always slightly wary of the use of large expanses of stainless steel in station interiors because of that reflectivity issue. You end up with an awful lot of blurry look, mirror looks, reflections. And this, in some respects, I think demonstrates actually what you can do if you have knowledge of colour and space. I think this works remarkably well. Well, moving one down, and I think this is a bit of a blurry image, so my apologies for that, but I thought it'd be useful before we have a look at the inside of Canary Wharf Station, just to give you an idea of the scale of the undertaking, the scale of the excavation that was required at this station, and indeed at many of them. Effectively, these were brownfield sites, so it enabled the construction basically of a vast box. But of course, the complication here at Canary Wharf was, the rather large-scale nearness of water and the fact that you were building this at the bottom of what had been a dock. So in fact, actually, the structure, the concrete box structure that you see that contains the station itself is enormous in scale, and also drives down a great deal underneath the platform level of the station. And underneath the platform and the tracks is quite a degree, actually. You can see a lower level of service rooms and corridors. Canary Wharf, I think, has become, interestingly enough, emblematic of underground stations in London. It's one of those stations, I think if you flick a picture of the station entrances up, most people would now associate it with London in some shape or form. And the iconic nature of that building is very well deserved. What you see here, the main photo, of course, is the main station box. And Foster chose to have this gull wing construction roof, which runs nearly the full length of the public areas of the station. It doesn't run the full length of the station box, because in fact the station box is probably about a third as big again at either end with the emergency staircases. But this soaring, real cathedral-like nave of a building basically is remarkably open, which is extremely useful for an underground station in terms of people being able to navigate their way around. And it also, of course, benefits from the great translucent nature of the entry arch here, of course, this vast atrium that covers the western entrances, the main entrances to the station, which are balanced by a smaller eastern entrance, I should say, at the other end. This soaring nature, we struggled with, of course, a few years ago with commercial advertising, with the proposal to put digital advertising screens in at this station. And I have to admit that my colleagues at the time in commercial development actually did heed advice, and we went back to Foster's to design the hanging screens to make sure that they are more, if you like, inherent, they're more holistic in terms of the station design than had previously been perhaps proposed. But you can see here, down the staircases to the intermediate level through the gate line here, the entrances at either side of this main ticket hall give access to the rather subterranean caverns of shopping centres and office entrances at Canary Wharf. And then the passenger leads down another series of escalators to the platform level. And probably the highlight here, the use, again, interestingly enough, of a sort of 1930s, 50s idea of these large-scale benches utilising the roundel as their back. I mean, these really do echo back to the 1930s ones, places like High Street, Kensington, but on a much bigger scale. These are massive. So these, in fact, become part of the highlight of the station at platform level, as well as giving you a very clear indication of which station it is that you are at. I suppose the other thing that we should mention here, of course, is that the extension was the first widespread use of platform edge doors on the Underground that you can see here at the edges. If we board the train and continue our station west, our travels west, we are skipping Canada Water Station, which again is actually an interesting one. But I thought we'd just take a quick look at Bermondsey Station, which is by Ian Ritchie. And it's interesting in that this was one of the stations that was always designed a bit like the Leslie Green stations of 1906 and 1907, with the ability to act as a plinth for an oversight development. And of course, the issue of oversight development has come somewhat to the fore with some of the Jubilee line stations in recent years. And it always amuses me slightly that one of the ones that was intended to have an OSD on it still doesn't have one, but then neither does Chalk Farm, I keep telling myself, or Lambeth North. The best laid plans. But Ian Ritchie very deliberately designed the station so that it would continue to work architecturally in terms of its feel, should an oversight development be constructed above it. And this is the maquette model of the station, shown to the planning department at the time. And it gives you a very good idea of the incredible amount of light that is let into this station, as you can see here from above. To show you the building in reality, again, a simple structure in many respects above ground. It's quite ephemeral in some respects, you could say, because of the fact that there was always potentially the possibility of actually reconstructing or building above. But here you see actually what are effectively the glass panels, the atriums, above the interior of the station. It's a difficult station to photograph, so my apologies for this. And it's partially due to the fact, of course, it's called light, which is one thing the architect wanted to bring into this station. And indeed, it's one of the very few stations that at platform level, at the east end of the platforms, you actually can see daylight, which is because it flows down the escalator shafts here. This is the main access down onto the platforms from the station ticket hall, which is at an intermediate level. You actually come in at street level, you go down to an intermediate level before you drop down, and you can see here the well, which runs the full height of the building from platform level, the base of the escalators, right up to ceiling level and the atrium level above street level. So this is an incredible drop, if you like, down the side of the station box. But it does give you a very clear idea of the flow. It's fascinating here in that as you move up and down the escalators, you can see people on the street, sort of at head height almost. And when you're on the street, you can see very clearly into the station. So you see passengers move in and out, backwards and forwards through the station. So that idea of flow is very, very strongly represented in terms of the layout and design of the building. One of the most striking features of this is at the east end, where the escalators drop down to platform concourse level, which are the use of these incredibly sculptural beams, which effectively, of course, hold that hole in the ground up. And I say sculptural because they really are, this vast crisscross nature of these beams that effectively hold the box up and apart. And in some respects, they, I suppose, remind you of Westminster Station, where, of course, those great crossbars hold the station box apart because of ground pressure. But a very sculptural feel to this station at platform level. I have to say that there's an awful lot of, well, there was certainly at the time, an awful lot of chit-chat and urban myth about Ian Ritchie architects and some illicit signage and seating that was delivered to this station. And the story goes that Ritchie's actually did a reversed out version of the station friezes with white lettering on a blue background. And indeed, I have seen a fragment of that. Apparently the Underground weren't at all impressed with this shift away from corporate standards. And the myth always was that the day before the station opened, it was all removed, along with some of the glass benches. But I wonder if that's not part of the mythology of the Underground, certainly of the Jubilee line, that was built up even at that time. But very, very fine building in many respects. We're going to move on now. We're going to pass through London Bridge. London Bridge Station I would love to show you if time allowed, because of course what's most interesting about London Bridge is it's a good example of actually where you have to feed a new railway through an existing and very complex station. So London Bridge not only was about the Jubilee line, it was also of course about a major capacity upgrade on the station, which included boring new tunnels for the Northern line that runs through the station there. And that, as I mentioned before, is where we stole some of the original the original 1890 tunnel from the diversion routes that we got from there. But the last station I thought we should alight on is the one that's actually drawn most attention over the last few years, in fact just after I left the company 4 years ago, which is Southwark Station, which is by McCormack, Jameson and Pritchard. And this is a perspective sketch by Duncan Lamb, who some of you may recall, of course, but for the Underground's architecture department. Southwark's an interesting station in that, of course, it was one of the stations that nearly didn't happen. It was a bit of a late starter in terms of planning. From a capacity and operational point of view, it would have been far easier to be able to run trains non-stop between Waterloo and London Bridge. The Underground doesn't much like frequent stops. Which is something we learnt in the 30s, when Frank Pick, of course, got in quite a lot of trouble about pushing the Piccadilly line north of Finsbury Park, and the argument that there should be a station every half mile. And it was decided most certainly there would not be, because that was always a problem with the original 1906, 1907. Too many stations, too close distance. So this are, in many respects, interestingly enough, in peak hours, it is interesting. If you're going to get held anywhere in the central area of the Jubilee line, it'll be probably either side of Southwark, purely and simply because of those short overlaps between Waterloo. But it was designed not only because of pressure from local politicians who wanted the area served by a tube station, a dedicated tube station, but also an issue of interchange with existing British rail stations, Network South East services. The closure of the Jubilee, the existing Jubilee into Charing Cross, of course, severed the link with the suburban railways that served south of the river. And of course, Southwark Station enables, with its entrances to Waterloo East, for passengers to continue that interchange between suburban services and the Underground. I have heard an interesting story, which is that it works quite differently in morning and evening peaks, which is that in morning peaks prior to the pandemic, is that you get quite large numbers of people leaving Network South East suburban services here and joining the Jubilee line, but in the evening peak far less, and that's because people, I think, psychologically feel if they go to Charing Cross, you get a seat on an empty train rather than one that's coming in. I've never stood and counted people in and out, I'll have to admit, but it's quite possible. It's an interesting example in many respects of how we try to make transport planning a very precise science, and in fact actually it's the art of psychology in some respects, how people eventually work their journeys out. But back to the station design, it is of this complex nature, first of all because of those two entrances, one at street level here on the corner of Blackfriars Road and the Cut, and the other, of course, the Waterloo East platforms effectively up on top of the railway viaduct. And that viaduct plays a key role in the design of this station because the running tunnels actually run effectively under the mainline railway viaducts in this part. So it accounts for these strange three separate escalator shafts. The best way of thinking of it is those escalator shafts fit in the arches. So you leave the piers of the viaduct supported. So this is a matter of threading those three escalator shafts through the existing brick arches to gain access to the lower station concourse. And the levels here are quite complex. Not only are you going from street level And viaduct level, you're going to an intermediate concourse level because of the drop of the escalator shafts, which are fixed in terms of geometry, down to that main intermediate concourse, which drops you down again through staircases to the platforms themselves. And one of the great things that McCormack, Jameson and Pritchard did here was, first of all, I think, both in terms of customer flow, join that quite complex journey together, but also architecturally managed to take those quite distinctive areas and forms within the station and give them the same architectural language. Lots of different shapes and spaces, which are very, very effectively joined together here. If the station has one drawback from a station planning point of view, it's that curved staircase down into the curved ticket hall. But it is a very dramatic space as you come in from the corner of Blackfriars Road and the cut opposite Palestra. And this ticket hall has real echoes of the 1930s and Charles Holden. It's most certainly got the look of Arnos Grove and Southgate about it. A pasimeter in the middle, in a very modern form, and then, of course, the use of lighting to lift the ceiling box. And in fact, the quality of materials here is really clever. It's very, very high. I once spoke to one of the engineers, and she'd been involved in the specification and overseeing the pouring of the concrete here, and they went to very great lengths to ensure very, very high quality finish of concrete in this works, and it certainly shows. But it also gives you an idea of the move through at the back of the ticket hall to the next component, which is the intermediate glazed atrium, which lights the top of the first flight of escalators down towards the intermediate concourse level. And here again you can see very strong use of light, both daylight allowed in, and also, of course, artificial illumination at night time, which allows the station in some respects to glow almost. You can also see the very high quality of materials here in terms of very standard underground granolithic floor, but the use of polished granolithic blocks for the side wall, very durable. It's a very fine material. I must admit I have an awful lot of time for it. But interesting to see it here used so extensively in wall finishes as well as floor finishes. And that drops you down, of course, to this remarkable space at the top of the 3 escalator shafts with the passageway leading through to Waterloo East Station in the distance. Now, this, of course, is subterranean. I think you're something like 23 metres below ground, I think, here. And, of course, the highlight of this space is that instead of just having a blank straight wall, is this incredible glass wall sculpture by Alexandra Belchenko, which is a remarkable piece of art. It's the biggest piece of public art on the Underground, other than the Paolozzi murals at Tottenham Court Road, and boy, are they big, I know. But I thought it'd be interesting just to actually have a little look at the design of these. Belchenko actually took, as his starting point, this Friedrich Schinkel illustration. It's an 1815 illustration from the Magic Flute, for a set for the Magic Flute, the Queen of the Night. And although, of course, obviously, our wall at the station doesn't have this remarkable crescent moon and the Queen of the Night rising, you can see the idea here in terms of this almost drawing together of the sky and the stars. And if you look actually at the construction of the panels, you can see by the use of this cross-etching on these suspended glass panels, you get that sort of idea of immense complexity in terms of its construction and its thought, but a remarkable simplicity in terms of actually what it delivers in that station. And it's an incredibly important highlight in many respects of the site. And it's one of the reasons why the proposals a few years ago for the oversight development at this station really did start to spark an awful lot of interest in this site and also the Jubilee line extension stations as a whole. There'd always been the intention to build an OSD at this site, and in fact the station ticket hall particularly was designed to act as a plinth, but for a fairly modest 12 to 14 storey building. And TfL came forward with proposals 3-4 years ago to build a much higher block, which would have involved widespread demolition of the ticket hall and intermediate concourse levels to support the building. And I was always slightly sceptical about the design, if only because from a personal point of view, I can say this now, we lost the street corner entrance. The entrance, although would have been simpler in terms of not having that flight of stairs down, was actually round the side, the back side of the station plot. And my own feeling is London Underground needs to fight very hard to make sure it gets the best possible space for its station entrances on the urban streetscape. You know, we're an incredibly important civic amenity. And, you know, we have every right to have, if you like, prime plot in terms of station entrances. To tuck station entrances away slightly round corners always seems to be underplaying and downplaying our role. It would also have meant, despite extensive studies, a degree of overcast, of losing quite a lot of the natural light that forms such an important part of the station design, including this wall. The wall wasn't to be touched, but the actual openness of the atrium above certainly would have been compromised. And it did spark a demand for this station to be listed by English Heritage. Now, many of you will have heard of the 25-year, 30-year rule, and it would have been certainly very unusual for historic England to have listed a building of this age. But nevertheless, the listing conclusion was actually quite strong. Although English Heritage rather tied themselves in knots with the description, it was incredibly important, but it wasn't quite important enough, I think was almost the line. And in fact, it is still the subject of a judicial review. But what it really does mean, apart from the fact it sparked a debate in TfL and planners, which has led to a much simpler solution, and I think a far more acceptable solution for an OSD at this station, it really does bring to mind the fact that, in fact, several of the stations that we have looked at are now not only on the cusp of being listable, but actually probably are listable. You know, listing isn't just about ancient buildings, it's also about representing and celebrating even quite modern buildings. And if you look at the lower concourses here, this almost ship prows-like centre to the staircases leading down to the platforms, I certainly myself think that this is probably one of the best pieces of 20th century, late 20th century architecture in London. You know, it's incredible use of space and light and material, which works remarkably well in many respects as an underground station. And I think it's interesting for those of us, you know, who look back over the architectural history of the underground. You know, it's difficult, I think, in many respects for those of us who worked on projects such as this to comprehend that these now are capable of being listed buildings. And this is one that certainly I think should be. So it's an interesting debate in the fact that these are very iconic already, very iconic. They were iconic when they were opened. These buildings won the Royal Fine Arts Commissions. They won the Architectural Awards for the year 2000. You know, they are a string, if you like, of architectural pearls strung across South and East London that work individually as buildings and yet actually work together as an operational railway line. And I think they're very worthy of being celebrated. And I will leave you just with one last one. So talking about the debate as to listing, with the view up the escalator to the Belchenko artwork. And in fact, actually, if you ever do get the chance, and there's nobody ahead of you on the escalator, which I suppose is more plausible at the moment than was 2 years ago, it is well worth casting your eyes up to the heavens and imagining the Queen of the Night at the top of those escalators and that remarkable piece of glass artwork. So thank you all for listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike, very much. I shall come across to my dark corner over here. If you have a question, and we've plenty of time for questions, could you wait for the microphone to come to you? I'll hand mine out to anybody sitting close to the front. And Jim, I think, is all there ready with another one for the people towards the back. That helps everybody here to hear, but also those who are listening on YouTube, so that we capture both the question and the answer. Can I start with one, Mike? Actually, I hadn't realised there was a threat to North Greenwich bus station. What's the issue with that?
It is a while, obviously. I mean, I'm 4 years out of date, although I do keep a bit of an eye open. I'm now, of course, resident in West Yorkshire, which is about as far away from zone 6 or 7 or whatever it is as you could possibly imagine. But certainly in the dying days of when I worked for LU 4 years ago, there was a proposal for quite widespread demolition of the surface buildings. It wouldn't have touched the actual tube station itself, but it would have shorn off the buildings at the top of the escalator shafts. And the bus station would have been very substantially reconfigured as basically the basement of a large block, of course, you know. And please don't get me wrong, you know, it's interesting from 2 points of view, I suppose. One of which is the importance of developing brownfield sites, and you know, North Greenwich has been an exemplar of brownfield sites, arguably ever since the underground opened there in 1999. You know, it's a sensible place to develop, of course it is. You know, it's got all sorts of excellent public transport links. For me, it was about two things. First of all, maintaining the integrity of that link for bus passengers and customers, because I felt the original proposals, and these may have moved on substantially since I was involved, actually really did shortchange our passengers, and I felt that was a very backward step. But I also think actually it's an incredibly important building in its own right. It does spark this debate, I think, about the fact that I mentioned during my talk that bus and coach station architecture actually is, you know, has seen a remarkable attrition rate, and it carries on. I mean, looking back sort of 40, 50 years, I've been interested in the industry. You know, even at my time at LTM, places like St Albans going, you know, almost every decent country area, London Transport country area, bus station or bus garage has gone in the last 20 to 30 years. And it always felt slightly odd to me that actually one of the most successful in terms of operation, as I was told by our operational people, as well as actually being one of our most significant structures of the late 20th century, was so easily under threat. And, you know, it's an evolving picture, but it's also about, I think, ensuring that when we replace, if we do make the sensible decision to replace such infrastructure, actually we're making it better for our customers in a holistic way, not just the finances of the organisation, which is incredibly important, but actually in terms of the utility of those pieces of infrastructure for, you know, for our paying punters. And as I felt that the proposals at North Greenwich really did shortchange an important element of the equation, which was the people who actually used it. I'm not sure what the status of events are still at North Greenwich. As I say, 4 years, you know, a lot's changed, obviously, but you know, I can fully understand the need to develop a site like North Greenwich. It makes eminent sense to do it. I think it's just a matter of giving it careful consideration and thought as to both the architecture and the utility of the infrastructure. Yeah.
Okay, there's a hand right up at the back who may be about to give us some answers. I don't know.
I won't be able to give you an answer other than I think that the proposals by Calatravas are probably overrun by huge amounts, whatever happens. But I wanted to ask about the Jubilee line extension. I remember was quite politically controversial, that it went over time, it went over budget, and politically the later DLR extensions were used as a stick to beat the Jubilee line extension with. You know, we should do it simpler, we should do it more cheaply, we should. And I wondered whether that had an effect on what happened with Crossrail, or what is happening with the extension to Battersea. Did that have an influence on station developments afterwards, good or bad?
Yeah. Yes. Now then, I'm going to try and get my thoughts in order. It's an interesting question. I mean, in many respects, I think it probably did. It's interesting. I think. Did it leave sort of cold feet? I suppose my era at the Underground was largely, of course, in the days of PPP. So two things. First of all, it was largely around modernising our existing infrastructure, which, of course, was in very poor condition. You know, that was the major task ahead of the infracos. So, in fact, it was largely around restoration rather than new. You know, our new projects tended to be either single station projects rather than groups of stations. Until, as you say quite rightly, we got into the Crossrail Elizabeth line era, and also, of course, the Battersea extension. I can deal with the Battersea extension in a far stronger way, because we were very heavily involved in that. That was an LU project in many respects. It involved close association, as did, of course, parts of the Jubilee line with developers. And it was interesting. I mean, in some respects, of course, the Battersea proposals have been scaled back. There's no two ways about it. And you can see the reasons why. Interestingly enough, I think some of the reasons behind the scale of the Jubilee line, of course, wasn't just about grandiosity of scale. It was also about ensuring, I think the Underground had long felt the issue of the fact that if you look back to the Victoria line, that everything was skimped in some way. It was built to the smallest possible dimensions that we could get away with. In terms, the tunnels were small, the passageways were small. One of the interesting things about the Jubilee line, which of course, did run massively over budget and over time. Two things, I suppose. One of which was the complexity. I think sometimes we tend to underestimate. The driving of the tunnels themselves is quite straightforward. It's when you get to the interchange stations that it becomes most complex. So if you do look at places like Westminster and you do look at places like London Bridge, you can see the sort of scale of that. It was interesting in the company looking back on the JLE stations. I had a manager in particular, whose name I won't mention, who cursed these stations. We used to say, it's marvellous, you can stand at the station entrance and you can see the trains meters below you running around, you can stand on the platform and get a suntan. And as he pointed out at the time, actually, from a customer point of view, these are bloody long stations, pardon my language, to walk around. Your actual customer disadvantage of time in terms of the scale of JLE stations is actually quite measurable. He once did it with a stopwatch. I forget which two stations he did it. And as he pointed out, it took longer to get in and out of the station than it did to travel on the train between the two stations. Which is one way of proving a point. So, I think, yes, in terms of scale, it is interesting. That future-proofing of design, it was designed to feel open and welcoming. It was designed to carry large numbers of customers without feeling constrained and constricted. And I think, interesting enough, Crossrail, we had very little to do with. For all sorts of reasons. It was very much a standalone project, and the few times I did have any sort of integration with Crossrail, I certainly think in terms of the scale of the infrastructure that they have been building, that again, they rather echo, if not in terms of finishes, they're much simpler, much more straightforward, so much more budget driven in that respect, although of course there is a degree of budget overrun. I think they've gone again for that idea actually of trying to make the infrastructure as large as possible in terms of things like sight lines and capacity. The Battersea extension, as I say, just briefly to come back to it, it certainly has been curtailed, both in terms of its scale and its operational capacity. Things like overrun tunnels have gone. I think largely they've been delivered. We had some very interesting debates at the start of the planning process. I don't think it doesn't really need editing out. I did sit in a meeting once and somebody said, Battersea, you can't possibly have a building that hides the power station. And I remember thinking at the time that would actually be quite difficult to do, given what else is going on in the vicinity of Battersea Power Station. But, that we really did need this thing about having a civic presence, about actually having station entrances which actually do not rely on sticking a roundel on a lollipop stick to say, here we are. That idea actually of having some form of architectural standing at street level as part of the civic environment was really important. And I was suitably pleased that many of the key elements of both Nine Elms and Battersea actually are still there. I said before I'd have my quibbles about some of the finishes, brushed stainless steel. I've seen people use Brillo pads on brushed stainless steel. I've seen people paint concrete, fair-faced concrete at Bank. There's always that sort of debate. Interesting enough for me, that debate echoes back the sort of finishes that we saw at North Greenwich. I think looking back, perhaps my team should have been far bolder. But so there are parallels and similarities, I think, without a doubt. Did the Underground get its fingers burnt on the JLE? I think possibly it did, in terms of this opinion that grew about the Underground's ability to project manage major schemes. I think it's been interesting, of course, that there have been so few major schemes for the Underground in the last 30 years, that in fact actually has that thesis ever been tested, if you know what I mean. I think Crossrail's quite separate in that respect. In terms of its management and its project and its scale, of course, it's a huge undertaking. But yes, looking back, I think I'm getting a clearer picture about the Jubilee line extension and the politics of it, the demands that were made of it, actually, you know, the design and build process of it, quite interesting, the complexities of it, and the political outfall from that. So, sorry, that rambled on a bit, but...
Okay, just before we move on from that one, just to stick with the original premise of the question, my recollection at the time, being there as you were but not as involved as you were in JLE, was that one of the ways in which the project was brought perhaps closer to its budget than it otherwise been was to cut back on some of the station finishes and so on. And I'm thinking of Westminster and the sort of great concrete slabs you see. Were those genuine savings rather than architectural design?
There were some changes, and interestingly enough, I mean, for example, London Bridge and Westminster, where you have those cast panels, the inset, you know, the idea that you kept the open tunnel rings and you effectively just use those clamped panels on them. And we did once find a panel, there was a proposal to do those inset with granite or marble. And the story goes that just proved too difficult, too expensive, and in fact cast metal was used instead. Oddly enough, speaking from a design point of view, I think the cast metal works possibly arguably better than any stone finishes. I mean, in terms of both durability and also, you know, one of the things, how I ever got the job at LU, I shall never know. I mean, because it was a rapid learning curve about durability of, you know, things that you don't have to worry about as museum curator. Durability of finishes, maintainability, soundproofing, sound deadening, you know, and of course, nice, bright, shiny surfaces, a bit like this microphone, echo around a building beautifully, you know, with two separate PA speakers in a station, you know, that soon starts booming around. And oddly enough, of course, the use of those almost perforated finishes, say at London Bridge and Westminster, arguably work better in terms of sound. I think there was a degree of pulling back, but I mean, my sort of understanding certainly is that Paolotti particularly actually did guide the architect's practices to some very basic finishes, so the large-scale use of finished concrete. I mean, looking back to Westminster, which was the station that, you know, I spent more time nosing around with on behalf of the museum, to the extent actually I think they thought I was working on the project at one point. I don't recall any major stripping back of design finishes. You know, and some of them came in for a lot of stick, like the checker plate flooring on the intermediate landings, you know, which is you know, I certainly would never have got away with that in my day in the underground. So I think largely it's interesting in that respect, Barry. I think they were relatively basic finishes in the first place, so I don't think there was much to be enabled in terms of budgetary stripping back from them. On that level.
Okay. Right, there's another question at the back. Richard's got his hand up. Oh, sorry, the lady's got the mic, so we'll take the lady first.
First of all, thank you very much. It was very interesting, and it's made me realise there are some stations I haven't been to which I ought to go and have a good look around.
Yeah, that's worthwhile. Thank you.
On a slightly different point, which I hadn't planned to make, I think Westminster Station is fantastic. I love it. I think when you go up the escalators or whatever and you see all those beautiful, well, I don't know what to call them, modern bits. But the reason I wanted to ask you a question was getting back to the bus depot, Greenwich bus depot. And I just wondered if you are really concerned about it. Have you thought of contacting the World Monument Fund? It is a charity in Britain, and it restores buildings under threat. And they have restored Preston bus station that was under threat. Most of their work is in places like Syria, but they do have quite a large programme in Britain, and I'm sure if you contacted them, World Monument Fund, they could at least look at it for you. And they said to me one day, when we stand up, everyone else stands down. So
I'll certainly pass that on. I mean, obviously, I do voluntary work for primarily for Save Britain's Heritage, and I do have contacts, slightly better contacts these days with the 20th Century Society after Tottenham Court Road. But nevertheless, yes, I mean, it will be interesting to see how that debate goes, you know. Primarily, I suspect the view of Historic England, obviously. And also, as I said before, you know, I can understand, you know, the need and the requirement, both financially and operationally, to look at assets. One of the things that was always interesting in my role in the company was I used to sit in meetings, you know, about conservation of already listed buildings and heritage-sensitive sites. I think one of the challenges we had, and one of the things that we brought to the table with people like Historic England and monument societies, was the fact that we can't afford a transport system like the Underground is evolving. You know, we can't afford to use heritage to pickle our system in aspect. So, you know, we were always at the forefront of that debate between demolition, modernisation, between renewal and restoration. I think generally, I think the company was held in very high regard in terms of how it did that. So, I mean, I've never ever thought in terms that the company's proposals for North Greenwich is willful at all. It's just part of business. As I think I explained before, my concerns are largely around the fact actually it's about replacing decent infrastructure with poorer infrastructure for the passenger. I think at the end of the day we have to champion our users rather than, well, alongside we have to balance that requirement with everything else, all the other financial aspects and redevelopment aspects and densification aspects that you know, projects such as that bring. But yes, I'll certainly pass that on to the 20th Century Society. Thank you.
Okay, can we get a mic to Richard at the back there? And then I think there was one in the middle of the hall.
You haven't all gone to sleep.
Just on the point we were discussing just now about the finishes at places like London Bridge, Westminster and so on, my recollection from my involvement in the project back in the very early 1990s was that what's appeared in practice, and okay, as you say, there may have been some scaling back, but certainly it's very much in line with what Roland Paoletti had in mind at the time, which is the basic finish. Yeah. Which brings me to the other point I was going to make. You did allude to it at one point, but the almost complete lack of commercial advertising of any conventional sort, as is illustrative in the escalator shaft there. Okay, you've got the trackside panels and other illuminated adverts, but the complete lack of any conventional commercial advertising in the places you normally expect to find them.
Yeah. I mean, that has obviously, you know, reared its ugly head. And it's interesting. I mean, I think going back to the lessons I learned, you know, I mean, commercial advertising has always been incredibly important to the Underground. You know, you only got to look back to 1906 and 1907, where in fact actually the first thing that happened, because the company realised it could make as much money out of advertising, was to cover all those lovely Leslie Green tile patterns on Yerke's tube stations over. You could equally argue that's one of the reasons why the roundel came into existence, to show you where the name was. I mean, without a doubt, I think there was a deficiency in terms of lack of advertising space. And certainly, you know, the best way to do that is to design it in holistically from the start. And we certainly did, looking back, obviously, at stations like London Bridge, end up with those, you know, remarkably complex retrofitting of escalator advertising panels. You know, I've always said that generally, I'll talk about this one in a minute, escalator panels, you know, obviously they're a brilliant source of revenue, and they are in a space where they can generally be handled very well in terms of what the public expect an escalator shaft to look like. The big debate, of course, for us was around Canary Wharf and the value of that digital screen, and that was a fairly acrimonious debate at times about, you know, the architectural openness and vastness of that space. You know, we heard arguments about health and safety of people being distracted by the advert and walking off the edge of the escalator. And, you know, it has happened, there's no two ways about it. It's interesting, going back to what was being said about the Battersea and Nine Elms extension, and in fact this came to light very strongly, if I remember rightly, at the Bank, the new Walbrook entrance to Bank. We felt that the advertising people would really want the blank end walls, you know, the head walls of escalators. And in fact nowadays they rarely don't want them. because, of course, the issue of maintaining assets above escalators is hugely difficult, so the nature of spaces. But generally, yes, if you can throw a brickbat at it, it's about the fact that in an ideal world, you do design advertising panels in holistically. When we navigated our ways through real stations, as well as, if you like, station designs, you get a fairly strong idea, actually, of the hierarchy of space, so that the primary position has to be, I've always argued, for customer signage, passenger signage, so that basically people can navigate their way around stations. And that leads to an interesting tension with adverts, because, of course, what the advertiser wants is to catch your eye, and not necessarily where we as station operators might want that to occur. So there's an interesting debate about the primacy of space and positions for signage and advertising. But it was interesting to say one or two of our more recent stations where I thought they really would have gone for the advertising spots, and actually commercial advertising weren't that interested. They were a bit too complex to maintain and manage. But I think you're absolutely right. Looking back, obviously, there was a degree of retrofitting. I mean, these stations weren't without their faults. Canary Wharf, where by millimetres, the height of the glass balustrades in the intermediate hall failed the railway inspectorate test and all had to be heightened. London Bridge, really good example, actually, of where the passageways lead off the platforms into the lower escalator shafts, so people knocking their head. The actual geometry of the space was such. So those large glass balustrades had to be built to take people away from corners. So not everything was designed perfectly. Just very briefly, in terms of, if you like, one of the things that I was very fortunate, I was allowed to develop a series of policies around particularly not just individual stations' heritage and design features, but also about lines. And we pushed through the board accepted two major ones. One was the Victoria Line design guidelines, which is about the perpetuation of Victoria Line finishes, 6x6 tiles, always keeping the back panels, Oddly enough, on the Jubilee line, which we did have a strategy for, it was actually to keep this station free of advertising in terms of no additional advertising. And it is interesting how sparse this one is. And there were occasionally proposals, for example, to put advertising panels at the base of the Belchenko glass panels. Which I must admit, it never annoyed me quite as much as fitting the rubbish bins underneath the Royal Fine Arts Commission award plaque, which probably annoyed me. And because I had to use this station latterly every day, every time I went in and out of that station, I could have torn that litter bin down with my bare hands. So, that whole idea of actually, station design isn't just about prettiness and being fanciful. I mean, obviously, one of the big things I had to learn very quickly in my job, because I'm not a station planner, was actually about taking all the requirements, station operations, architectural aspirations, maintenance, the needs of commercial advertising, the needs of the people who operate our stations, the operators. For years, their needs and requirements, you just need a back room. Well, perhaps you don't. Perhaps you actually need something that enables you to operate this station correctly. So getting it all right in that mix is quite fascinating. I think in that respect, there are certain key Jubilee line stations where, I have a suspicion, I don't know, I was never part of the discussions. You sometimes get the impression, though, that perhaps somebody did pipe up and say, can we have some adverts? And Roland just quietly breezed on. Okay, just leave that to me, nothing ever happened. But yes, it's interesting how I think if we would, the team I work with at London Underground were part of station design, we would have probably taken a slightly more holistic view of integrating services into these finishes. Sorry, another rambly answer.
There was a hand, did I see a gentleman there, close to that mic?
Hello. I wanted to know, architecturally, what is your favourite station on the Underground and what is the worst?
How I hate that question. I sometimes think, that my audiences plant somebody to ask me that question every time. And I'm bound to offend somebody, no matter what I say and how I say it. I could give you the pat answer, couldn't I? Which is, of course, I love all of them, all 275. Was it 285 now? I used to be able to tell you the ones that I'd quite cheerfully take a bulldozer to on a fairly regular basis. I think the fascinating thing about the Underground is just that span of architectural styles that it has. And in many respects, each one has merits, you know, and there are stations that I grew very fond of because obviously I worked, you know, on the restoration of, you know, faience facades at South Kensington. The rest of the station is a bit of a shambles, but anyway, the outside of it looks quite smart. I must admit, I mean, it's difficult not to admire Charles Holden's work because of their boldness in many respects. Going back to what we were saying, which is that, you know, from an operational point of view, those Holden stations can be a nightmare. They're very drafty, I'll tell you that much. It's interesting to notice that the latter one's got doors. I wonder why that was. But, you know, just the generosity of space and the inherent... I think one of the things for me that makes Charles Holden stand out as an architect is he was an architecture of interior spaces as much as exterior spaces. Which I've always found fascinating. But it's easy, you know, equally I can throw brickbats at some of the stations in that they tend to fall apart at platform level. You know, quite often Holden didn't see an entire station through, if you know what I mean. I grew to love Tottenham Court Road, the great Marmite moment of the Underground, where when we did the congestion relief works 10, 12 years ago now, of course, there was a very strong feeling in the company that we should spray-crete the Palazzi murals and get them out of the way, as well as removing the walls that they were on. And that was one hell of a battle, I'll be quite honest about. You know, whatever we did there was wrong to somebody. And we, you know, obviously it was a massive learning curve. But actually, the more I think about it, some of those 1970s and 80s, you know, things like David Gentleman's mural artworks, which we'd never get away with now because they take all the advertising space on the walls, actually, I like. But yeah, I think I must admit, I like Westminster. If I had to choose one station, and perhaps that's because I've got a very personal attachment to it. I knew the people who built it very well. I was involved with some of the project team there. As I say, from the day they took possession of the St Stephen's Club, I was there to the day it opened to the public. So it's the one station I've sort of ever seen all the way through process. You know, it's like I never saw a train fleet through process on the Underground. I'm still slightly spitting feathers that didn't see the new Piccadilly line rolling stock through the design book phase to build. But I think Westminster it's the space. It's as our other question, that's the other question was, it's just that incredible nature of the space, the spatial nature inside. So I think, yeah, stations, you know, we've got pretty stations, you know, like Loughton. I'm very fond of Loughton, interesting enough, not by an Underground architect, of course, by Murray Easton Partners for the LNER. You know, we're very fortunate. We've got some superb, if you like, country-style stations, you know, on the GR and GNR lines. You know, some of the best preserved. Snaresbrook is a gem. Snaresbrook station is incredible. How that hasn't been listed, I shall never know. And if that's broadcast, bad luck to HE. You know, it is quite a remarkable survivor in so many ways, and it shows the progression from the original Eastern Counties Railway to the GR, to the LNER, to London Transport, you know. So we're very fortunate we have such a wide breadth of stations that you can choose from. But yes, so my split is almost between, if you like, station exteriors. So, you know, you've got, I mean, Arness Grove has to be a very strong, you know, in terms of its exterior. Westminster for its interior, closely followed possibly by those ruddy mosaics at Tottenham Court Road, because I think I always used to say that, you know, when I eventually popped my clogs and, you know, you sawed me in half, you'd find a roundel. I'm beginning to think you'd found Palazzi murals nowadays, but anyway. But yeah, I think they're probably sort of about my best ones.
I'll see if I can push a little.
Pardon?
Where was the bulldozer heading?
The bulldozer ones, well, there's not much surface. I mean, if they somewhere at Old Street, Oh, God, it's interesting looking back on stations that we came up with proposals to do something with. And, you know, we never, for whatever reason, of course, obviously, station plans fall apart. You know, I mean, we spent a lot of time, obviously, redesigning Camden Town until that got canned. But no, there are, I mean, I must admit, Old Street to this day, it's one of those stations that even to travel through sort of makes you think, we really, you know, I know it's interesting, of course, at platform level. It was one of the trial designs almost in some respects for some of the Victoria Line finishes. And that leads me on to my absolute bête noire of a station, which I shall let slip of in a minute. And it's one of those stations where, you know, I can sort of see the bare bones of the possibilities of that station. Every station, I'm not slagging stations off, and I don't want to make the staff who work there feel as if they work in the worst station on the Underground, because it's not my business anymore. Old Street is a bit of a disaster area, but the one, and I recently, I'm blabbering a bit now, I gave a Zoom lecture on, interestingly enough, was the history of Highbury and Islington Station. Oh yes, that got quite a few groans from the audience. And I mean, H&I really is a disaster area. And I remember working with Tim O'Toole when he was MD, and we came up with, it's a very complex station. This is another talk, isn't it, Highbury and Islington Station. Have to be
Quarter of an hour left, yep.
What I was going to say is closing time. Oh, yes, right. But H&I, obviously, you know, it really is a shambles at street level. And, yeah, I know it's complex. And I've spent a lot of time looking in the archives as to why potentially it was so complex. And it's, you know, it's to do with land ownership and network rail and overbridges and this, that and the other. And eventually I landed actually very late on when I need to do some more research on it. I think it's only ever been a temporary building because it suddenly dawned on me, of course, it was slap bang in the middle of Ringway 2, the GLC's great motorway box. And if you actually look at the plans, it would have sheared through Highbury Corner, almost where Highbury and Islington Station is. But, you know, there is a campaign to rebuild the original North London Railway H&I station, which I think is an interesting one. There's, I think, you know, there is a bit of the original station column there. I'm not quite sure you can grow it from the rest of it. But H&I is pretty awful, I think, you know, both in terms of piecemeal, you know, additions. You know, if ever there was a station that really does deserve a new station box and look, I think it's probably that one. So yeah, that's my worst, H&I and Old Street. So.
Excellent. Right, we'll have the last one from Stephen down here, and I can hand the mic over.
Thank you. Obviously, the extension stations were designed in the days of ticket offices and the need to accommodate queues at the windows. Now that ticket offices are no longer a thing, would that make a difference to station design?
It does. It's interesting, you know, because as you say, and there are people in the audience here tonight who spent quite large chunks of their career putting ticket offices into underground stations, only for us then to go back and ask the question 20 years after, how do we take them out? Which is actually a very difficult job. I mean, yes, obviously it's changed a degree of the rationale. I mean, you know, the need for secure suites in that respect, you know, the need, obviously, one of the big things around the UTS was about building secure spaces for money handling, and the fact that technically, you know, there's no need to handle money now. I mean, obviously, in the latter days of my career, there were still ticket machines which needed a degree of attendance. You know, you have to be able to get in them, and the debate about front-loading machines and rear-loading machines did change the operation. I mean, one of the main things around station design really is the transfer of importance, I think, over the past 50, 60 years, where the ticket office was the major function in terms of station operations, to the station control and operation rooms, which of course now is the major hub, you know, and reconstruction of existing stations. You know, if we ever did manage, there were lots of stations we'd have cheerfully, I'd have loved to have taken the ticket office out of Rayners Lane and reopened the northern entrance. Really would have loved to have done that. You know, the UTS ticket office there so affected the flow, it so affected the architecture. Yeah, but trying to take a fairly, almost like a strong room out of the station doesn't come cheap in that respect. But the control rooms are now even more significant and more expensive to move. So I think in that respect, there's possibly almost like there's been a shift, but actually only a slight shift in terms of actually what's needed in ticket hall levels from an operations point of view. So that swap from ticket office importance over to control room importance. I mean, it'd be interesting to see in the next few years even if there's a need for ticket machines. And we've just been talking about UTS, Nick. So yeah, you stepped in at the right time. But, you know, I think it's going to be interesting to see if there's even a need for ticket machines in the next few years. And obviously the nature of gate line flows. I mean, gate lines do have uses, obviously, in that it allows you to control the flow of customers through a ticket hall. I'm sounding very Birmingham now. I always slip back into my Brummie childhood and I say ticket hall. But, you know, I can just as a last anecdote, I can remember, you know, the issue about between traditionally underground stations have Boswick gates. And we had a few stations which had very big Boswick gates, and we had to do trials to see if all the station staff could actually physically drag the gates backwards and forwards. So, of course, the next obvious suggestion is shutter entrances. But in fact, you know, it's actually a Boswick gate. A gate that does that is really useful for controlling the flow into stations. A shutter is not as much use unless you want people to sort of limbo dance under it, or they're quite short, or they're prepared to crawl into a station. And I'm sure some of us remember City Gents on the Friday night. Crawling into a station was probably the best thing they did. But it's interesting, yeah, as you say, that is the nature of the entrance to a station changing, I suppose, is really what. And yes, it is. It's shifting. And, you know, it's not for me to discuss the politics of ticket office closures, but, you know, the idea behind staff meeting and greeting. I think one thing that the Underground has carried forward, and quite rightly, is, you know, the need for a human presence, to have members of station staff available for passengers, I think is really key, and I think they've been very strongly about that. But it also leads me, you know, in all the years I worked for the company, in one role or another, you know, never directly operationally as such, but the highest admiration I have, I still think that the most difficult job on the Underground is basically a Zone 1 gate line attendant. Because I think if anybody can do that job, sort of, you know, you're a slightly better person than I am. You know, they're the real people. They're the real face of the Underground. You know, if no matter where they are there dealing with our passengers day in, day out. And that goes to the core, as I think I've hoped to try to say, about station design. You know, it has to work both for, you know, it has to work for our passengers as well as, in fact, it has to work for our operational staff to enable them to carry on with their journeys. So, yeah. Thank you.
Okay, I shall draw the line there. Before I thank Mike, just to recap, we will have one last meeting here before we break for Christmas, and in fact it'll be an extended Christmas break because we can't come back into the Cubic Theatre during January because there's some work's going to be carried out here. So the last meeting until next February will be on the 13th of December. We will open up the bookings for that on the website during the course of tomorrow morning, so you can book if you want to come. And I should perhaps say that if anybody didn't come to Andrew Braddock's talk a month ago, which was a great forceful presentation on transport policy, that's available online through YouTube. And so too is the talk which was to an invited audience a couple of months ago now by Sir Peter Hendy. And if you haven't looked at that one, I urge you to do that. An excellent presentation on the recent organisation of the railways post-privatisation and a look very much from the inside, knowing what Sir Peter knows on how Great British Railways may develop in a year or so's time. So those are two past ones to look at on YouTube, as this one will be, but as many of you as can come on the 13th of December, but please book. We look forward to seeing you there for Oliver Green's talk on London railway stations. Mike, thank you very much. Excellent, informative, entertaining presentation. Thank you for being very forthcoming in the answers to those questions. Diplomatic, I think, but forthcoming as well. It is always, as I've said many times from this spot, really good to hear from people who were there at the time, who were party to the discussion, know what the issues were, what the challenges were, what the comments and criticisms were, to get it, if you don't mind me saying so, from the horse's mouth in the nicest possible way. So I'd ask you please, ladies and gentlemen, just to say thank you in the usual way to Mike. Thank you for attending. Safe journey home for those that are actually leaving physically this place as opposed to simply switching off their YouTube. And we'll see you in December.